Well, hello everyone, and good afternoon. Happy Wednesday. Thank you so much for rejoining us again on our midweek study. Hope you had an enjoyable Memorial weekend. And we're diving back in again to Daniel chapter 8 and picking up with the verse here that is in verse 15. And recapping a little bit, Daniel had a vision, which he's had numerous of them, but this vision again, will take us into more of what some would consider prophecy of things to come. And so remember, as we read through this, there's just a few little tidbits I want to point out for you to think about. And then we're going to go back and look at the Hebrew in a way that we can take a look at some of the words and just try to get a feeling for, okay, Daniel had this vision. How did it affect him? Who was he speaking to? Who was speaking to him? What kind of realm was Daniel in? Obviously, visions and dreams are things that some people have had personal experiences with. I can't say that I have. I have heard and had experiences with God that match biblical principles and biblical teachings. But to say that I have experienced visions or anything like what we're about to read here is challenging for me to relate to. And maybe each of you have your own way of processing this, but there's just a few things that stand out. So we're going to start by reading in the Hebrew text of the um, JPS version here, Hebrew Bible. And here in verse 15, the English says, "And it came to pass when even I, Daniel," again, the repetition here causes the scholars and us also, we look at it and say, well, why did he have to repeat himself? Why didn't he just say, I saw the vision? Why does he use the term Ani, Daniel? I saw this, I saw it, even I saw it. Um, so again, putting ourselves in that frame of mind of how was Daniel feeling after he saw this vision. He said, I saw the vision, I sought to understand it, and behold, there stood before me the appearance of a man. Again, the words are very deficient in explaining all what's going on here. We want to know every little detail. It says he saw the appearance of a man. So, what was it that gave him the indication that it wasn't a man? And he didn't know if it was an angel. He saw an appearance of a man. So hold on to that thought. And then verse 16 says, And I heard the voice of a man. So the voice was a voice of a man. How would that distinguish from a voice not from a man? What other kind of voice has he heard to where he could tell the difference between the voice of a man and the voice of something that wasn't a man? We would say what else could speak? Um, Angels, God's presence, voices in realms of that are challenging for us to understand. We've seen in the Bible where animals have spoken. We've seen where voices have come, or read where voices have come from clouds, from the sky, from places that are not attributed to any location other than they heard it. And so, again, this is very interesting. So he heard the voice of a man, and then we go down between the banks of this river, Ulai, who is called, and then it's challenging here to say who is talking and who is being spoken to. It says, who called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. So it says, he came near where I stood, this image. And when I came, I was terrified and fell on my face. So up until this point, we don't see where Daniel had any fear or any emotion that would, is even detected in any way. Obviously, this had to be a challenging experience, a troubling experience, had to affect him in some way. But here, when this Gabriel comes near to him, he was terrified, and it said he fell upon his face. And then he said unto me, Understand, O Son of Man, another very interesting word used here in the Bible, for the vision belongs to the time of the end or the end times. And then verse 18 says, Now as he was speaking with me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face toward the ground. But he touched me and set me upright and said, Behold, I will make thee to know what shall be in the latter time of the indignation. Another interesting word. For it belongeth to the appointed time of the end. Oh, so many just cryptic words here. Um, Now, Daniel was afraid, terrified, fell to the ground, and as this being Gabriel was speaking to him, he fell into a deep sleep with his face on the ground. So, how did he fall into a deep sleep? How could he still keep hearing things? What kind of realm was he in? Wasn't he already having a vision, which would say that he was in an altered state of reality? And this was a different altered state. Yeah, again, many, many questions. So let's take a look at what the commentators have to say here. Um, they say that the understanding of the vision talks about the appearance, and the commentators say that Daniel recognizes this was not a real human being. Here we get a little bit of a clue, and this is what we're going to look into when we get into the Hebrew words themselves. It uses the word gever, which for man, but gever, the first letters of the Gimel and Vav also form the name of Gavriel. The V and the B's can be pronounced either hard as a B or soft as a V. And so just a little bit of Hebrew grammar there. So this could be Gavriel or Gabriel, or as we say in English, Gabriel. And the word for man is Gaver or Gever or Geber. But it's a different type of man rather than Adam. Many of you may be familiar with the word for man in the Bible being Adam, which is where Adam's name come from, which means man. Well, Gever has a different meaning to it, and so we're going to take a look at that. Then verse 16 talks about the voice of a man, and the commentator says that this was of a super versus that of a supernatural being. And so they try to explain it as a voice speaking in the human language. Going down about the banks of the Ulai, we talked about this earlier, what that meaning was. And then here, the commentators point out the name of Gabriel, the first time that is an angel is named in the Bible. He's referred to again in chapter 9, verse 21. And of course, in Jewish literature, this is something that Christians wouldn't be aware of. But in Christian literature, we're familiar with Gabriel and Michael. Those are the only two that are named in the Bible that Christians read. But in Jewish literature, they feel that there are four types of angels. There's Gabriel, there's Michael, there's Uriel, and then there's Raphael. And those names of like Raphael and Uriel show up in other types of writings. You may have even heard them and been familiar with them. So here, the angel Gabriel, according to Jewish literature, is mentioned in apocryphal and Kabbalistic writings. These are extra biblical writings that were written many centuries and millennial ago, and that are somewhat core to the Jewish tradition, and they are read for extra learning. And in that, it's said that Michael stands on God's excuse me, Raphael, Gabriel stands on God's left, and Michael stands on God's right hand. So this is kind of interesting that in the Jewish mindset, with God on his throne, Gabriel's on the left side and Michael's on the right side. So again, in the Christian tradition, this is something we've never really delved into. So commentary on verse 17 says he fell on his feet. Excuse me, fell upon his face. And they point out that the only prophet that stood on his feet while talking with a divine presence was Moses. Other prophets fell down prostrated themselves and their faces would touch the earth, but not Moses. So Moses is given elevated status in Jewish literature. Then it talks again about the phrase Son of Man. If you read through the book of Ezekiel, you'll find this is very frequently used in Ezekiel more than 100 times in the book. Now, for those of us who are Christians and read the Christian literature, the New Testament, the Son of Man terminology is very prominent in the writings of the New Testament, assigned to Jesus. He uses it. It is really, other than the book of Ezekiel, one of the first times it shows up again. So again, that adds a little bit of mystique to it, a little bit of interest for us as we try to decipher the term of Son of Man, the term Son of God, are terms that are used in Christianity that we look for a reference in the previous Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, to see who are they referencing to, what they apply to, what's the meaning there for that. And so this is again very interesting for us to take a look at that. As we continue, we see the end times being spoken about, and then Daniel falls into a deep sleep, but yet he's then caused to stand upright. And then as we close out, where we're going to stop today, talks about indignation or God's anger. And we'll take a look at that too. If time allows today, or we pick on it next week, because anytime I see attributes in the Bible that talk about God's emotion, especially his anger. We have determined that um, it the word for anger is not always the same way as we relate to it in our 21st century understanding of anger. And trying to balance God's anger with God's mercy and God's love and God's compassion. And so again, knowing in Hebrew, there are many different words for anger. Now we come up with a new one called indignation. And so that's going to be a very interesting one that we go and take a look at. So moving from the Jewish commentary, let's take a look at the Hebrew in Daniel and take a look at a few very, very interesting verses. So we are looking at verse 15, Vayehi bar oti, I had seen Ani Daniel, and this vision, and I was seeking the meaning, Binah Vehine. Vehine is a very interesting phrase used in the Bible, mostly translated as behold. It always seems to occur whenever something of great significance spiritually, in a spiritual realm, is taking place. So, hine. So it's interesting that they translate this as suddenly, vehine, rather than behold. And there stood one before me, the appearance, and then here's of a man, but here's this word gabar or gaver. And of course, down at the bottom of your screen, I was able to scroll it just enough that you can see the name Gavriel, and even if you can't read Hebrew, you can see that this first little character here, which is a gimel, matches this first little character here. The second one, which is the bait, matches this character, and then the resh matches this character. So Gavriel has the first three letters of the word gavar. So we start to see that connection here. And then, of course, the last part of Gavriel is the Aleph and the Lamed, which is the Ale or El. And you'll notice that in the ending of Daniel or Daniel, Yoel or Joel, um, all have the EL at the end of them. And many other biblical names will have EL, and that means of God. So here is a valiant man of God. So let's unpack that word here and see what the concordance tells us. Again, remembering that the V and the B in Hebrew are used interchangeably. One is pronounced a V sound, softer. It's called a Dagesh Lene, and Lene type, a softer. And then there is the Forte, which is a harder pronunciation if it has a dot in it for the harder pronunciation. Notice here in the entire scriptures, Gabriel is only used 2 times, and both of these in Daniel here in the Old Testament. And so, again, very, very interesting to learn the words of these beings. What's also interesting, too, is the idea that there are angelic beings is not universally accepted in all of the Jewish tradition and Jewish teaching. And I don't know if you've ever wondered about it. You know, we talk about it in Christian tradition and teaching that people would have a guardian angel and that there are angels sent. And some parts of Jewish tradition say, well, why does God need helpers? You know, God's spirit fills the universe. God is everywhere. God's presence lives within us today. God's presence moves. And what is the reason for angels in the first place? What is the reason for these divine helpers that we see? Um, Interesting questions. I have no good answer for them. Something you can think about, but we do see that they are there. In the book of Genesis, Abraham had 3 visitors. Lots of debate over who those visitors were. Angelic beings, supernatural beings, um, just men, or theophanies, which would be God in human form. We don't understand those completely, but we do see that there's something there. There are uh, types of entities there that we are still learning about, and maybe someday we will know more. But for right now, we seek and we try to understand. So as we go to this man who was speaking to him, and this Gabriel came near to him and wanted to tell him some things. So um, we look at verse 17. It says it came near to where he was standing, and he was afraid. Let's take a look at this word fear, because as I had mentioned to you, that Daniel was not afraid prior to this. You would think, I think I would have been terrified the whole time, unless there was a calming presence of God there in his presence that you didn't feel any fear. Um, I'd like to think that that's what took place, but let's take a look at this word 1204. This is not the normal word for fear. Normal word for fear begins with a ra type, um, and so this is not the normal word for fear. This is ba'at. So we look at this definition, means to startle, to dismay. Um, those are on much lower emotional spectrum levels than what terrify or even fear. So again, remembering that Hebrew is a very word poor language, meaning there's only about 7,500 words in the biblical Hebrew narrative, and so words have different meanings. And it's hard to pin that down. You have to have discernment. And in the Hebrew realm, you'd have the teaching of the rabbi who would share with you from their traditions what this word meant. Well, here it's translated as terrify, but it doesn't have to be. It can be just startled. And so, was Daniel startled? Or was he terrified? We see here that's used many places in the Bible. It can be troubled in the King James Version and can be terrorized. And so it troubling is a much different understanding for me in English than terrorizing. Here it can be overwhelmed. Being overwhelmed is much different than being afraid. And so I tend to think that in this realm where Daniel was already in God's presence, had already seen this vision, sees this being Gabriel come near to him, I think he was overwhelmed because look at the consequence. He fell down to his face. Now, did he fall because he was so terrified that he just, threw himself on the ground? Or did he pass out? Like, was his spirit uh, kind of taken from him, if you will, in a way that we would say he was just overcome, he was overwhelmed, and his knees got weak. I can relate to that. We've been there where we've had things come in our life where circumstances were just so overwhelming, so much was going on, our mind couldn't process it, and we've just slumped down, we've slumped into a chair. um, Not that you were unable to stand, but it was just that your knees were weak, your legs were weak, you felt like you had no strength, and you just slumped down. Um, the word here is fa'al, which is to fall, nafal. Um, so it is a normal word to fall, but it can be cast down. It could be to fail. If your legs would give out from underneath you, you would still use the word nafal. So I tend to think this is what's happening to Daniel. He was just so overwhelmed by sensory overload of what was happening here that he dropped to his knees. He fell down on his face, but notice he's still able to speak. So he's not dumbstruck, which, we do find that occasionally in the Bible where people are dumbstruck by what's happening and they're unable to speak. I've been there where things have just been so overwhelming that I have a hard time finding even the ability to form words. But Daniel wasn't that overcome. He could still speak. And then but here also, too, who is speaking to who? It's a little challenging in the Hebrew to determine who's speaking. Did Daniel speak first and speak to him, and then Gabriel spoke back? We do know that Gabriel's speaking here where he's saying, I want you to understand, and then it uses the Ben Adam, translated as son of man. Interesting that it uses the word Adam here because that is referring to a mortal man, someone from the earth, more of in some ways it's used to describe the more carnal side of man. I don't believe that's totally the reference here, but it is giving reference to the separation of, I believe, the two entities of Gabriel being in a spiritual plane and Dan Daniel here being in a natural plane and identifying the Adam, and so you have the Gavar applied to Gabriel, and you have the Adam or of the earth being applied to Daniel. And again, very, very interesting. So we get to verse 18, and it says, while he was speaking, a deep sleep came upon him. This is going to be a little deeper in our study today, and I see our time is running out. So I think we're going to stop here at the end of verse 17 and come back next week and pick up with verse 18 and unpack this word of a deep sleep with his face to the ground. I hope you're enjoying this. This is really incredible for me to try to gain some understanding of what Daniel could have felt when he was in the presence of Gabriel. So God bless you all. Hope you enjoy this. And thanks again for listening. And look forward to seeing you next week. Bye bye.